apart from the fact that I suppose we're in a really exciting phase at the moment, and what myself and others feel very strongly is that we've got this fantastic opportunity to make sure that everyone gets on board. So all of the things that we're doing and talking about aren't just to do with people who've got sustainability in their job title. It's actually everyone's job to be an advocate for the environment, for taking responsibility in their role or within their organisation for what they're doing and their impacts, and for making sure they've actually got something in Wales called the Future Generations Act, which kind of sums it up. And we kind of all need to do that. We all need to be protecting all of our lives and livelihoods really for future generations, and obviously making sure that our environment is protected.
Hello and welcome to Navigating ESG in Facilities in the Workplace. My name is Darren Pardy and I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Daly, who is an Associate Director for Turner Townsend. Sarah, thank you very much for joining me. How are you today?
I'm really good, thank you, Darren. Thank you for having me along.
Thank you. Before we get into ESG, just 5 quick fire questions, please.
Okay.
Keep it a little bit lighthearted. What is your favourite film?
I think my favourite all-time film is probably High Society, but I'll be a little bit cheeky on this one because it's not exactly a film, but I'm a bit obsessed with Hamilton at the moment. So the Netflix version of Hamilton,
Right.
big
Okay.
favourite.
Do what you want. Favourite song?
Again, I've got so many, it's really difficult to think of one, but I think I would go for Teardrop by Massive Attack.
Oh, very nice. Big fan. Favourite band or artist?
Keane, probably, all-time favourite.
Cool. Favorite place to go in the world, can be anywhere, even local.
I think probably Antibes in the south of France, where I've got a tiny little weeny pied à terre, so I like to go there to escape.
Very nice. And are you one of those people that like to have pineapple on their pizza?
No.
Good. Glad to hear it. So Sarah, how did you get involved in sustainability? What's your background? Was it a passion from a young age?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I've had an extremely eclectic career, I think is probably the best way to describe it. Funnily enough, I started off as a photographer. I started off as a freelance photojournalist, and was totally obsessed with going down that route, and actually did my first degree in photography. But towards the end of that, decided that I probably wasn't going to make much of a living out of particularly what I was studying, which was reportage photography. And I think that was probably a good call at the time. So I kind of gravitated really more towards marketing and visual communication. It was actually a visual communication degree, really, but specialising in photography. So actually, a year after I graduated, I set up my own consultancy in marketing.
Right.
Quite an audacious thing to do at the age of whatever I was, 22 or 23. But as you do at that age, you think you know it all. So I kind of went ahead with the confidence of not knowing what I didn't know. But it actually worked really well. And I sort of ran that consultancy for probably the best part of 20 years, really. But during that time, worked with a whole range of clients, including quite a few in built environment. And I got increasingly interested in not only built environments, but I was introduced, luckily, to some projects involving regeneration, and particularly one project, which was the turning point for me, which was the Sherwood Energy Village. I was working on a major contract, ERB2 funded project, with local authorities and regional regeneration people. And at that point, then got introduced to my first net zero development, really, and that was in the late 1990s. So pretty well ahead of its time at that stage. But I was absolutely convinced that everything we should do, it should be in that way. It just seemed completely counterintuitive not to build things in the most sustainable way. And so really I kind of changed direction from that point, really. So I began to focus really on built environment and sustainability from that point. I divested my interest in my own marketing business and actually reinvented myself effectively as a sustainability consultant in the early 2000s. I relocated from the East Midlands back to Gloucestershire, which was my home county, and was very lucky then at that stage to be able to get on board with some really interesting clients, ranging from planning consultants and contractors and architects. And that then led into another sort of quite interesting move. I was consulting for a firm of architects, and they then asked if I would be interested in becoming a non-exec director. So I did that for a couple of years, and then the founder directors wanted to retire, and I was helping them to recruit somebody to lead the practice because there wasn't an obvious business person within their team. And we ended up somehow with me getting the job as managing director. So
Right. Okay.
yeah, it wasn't an intended sort of change for me, but it was actually a really interesting point in my career.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I said I'd do that for a couple of years. It turned into 3 years. It was probably not the best timing in that literally within a month of starting, we had the global financial crisis. So it very rapidly moved from an incredibly full order book into one where pretty much the whole market was flatlining. But in a way that was good, because not being an architect and coming from a marketing background, I could look at how we could pivot the business, what we needed to do to change and relate to what was likely to be coming down the road in terms of market changes. So actually it worked out really well, because I was able to reposition the business as a sustainability-led practice. And we managed to, well, we got involved with things like BIM very early in the market, and were able to win contracts that were probably outside of our scale and scope as a fairly small regional business, had we not gone down that route. So in the end, we were able to sort of navigate that quite well. But after 3 years, I thought, well, I've done as much as I can do here. And I wanted to go back into consulting and sort of work with a broader range of clients. So I did that, set up my own consultancy, had been doing a lot of blogging and writing under the name My Green Eye. So I then created that as the consultancy, and simultaneously wanted to consolidate my, I suppose, market experience with a qualification. So I did an MSc in Sustainable Development part-time, which was quite challenging as a single parent with 2 young children and working full-time. But anyway, I got through that, and then had a really interesting role as European Head of Marketing for SLR Consulting, which took me into all sorts of interesting areas across globally, coordinating and managing a lot of their marketing and business development. And then after that, went back into consulting for myself very briefly, and then joined Sustainable Homes, which is a not-for-profit. And in that role, I was able to get much more involved in the, I suppose, shaping of the market with net zero and affordability, and trying to look at ways in which the market could again pivot and change to the requirements of all of the benefits, I suppose, of more sustainable homes. So what happened next? Unfortunately, our team there was disbanded. And it was a sort of change of CEO and a change of corporate direction for our parent company. So I went back into consulting again as an individual. And then we kind of hit COVID times and things. And I actually ended up in France for most of last year. So I was continuing to work with a number of clients from there, and also, again, quite fortuitously, but I got invited by a couple of universities to get involved in lecturing and running courses. So I was doing that mostly up to MBA level, actually, on sustainability, leadership, CSR, management and marketing, those sort of topic areas. So quite a broad spread, really. So that was interesting. And then Turner Townsend knocked on my door and scooped me up last summer. So I returned from France, and since then I've been working on a really exciting range of consulting projects.
Well, so quite a journey.
Yeah.
Um, and so you mentioned earlier that you've been involved in kind of net zero projects since the late 90s. So you've
Mm.
had the obviously 20 odd years now, and then you've had the financial crisis 2008 2009, and then you obviously sustainability net zero ESG probably become quite a big thing in the last few years. Have you noticed the conversations that you've had over those sort of 2 decades, are they different now to what they were 10 years ago and what they were 20 years ago?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I would say really the turning point was probably in the last 2 to 3 years,
Right.
where I could talk to a wide range of people, even very senior people within large organisations in the built environment, and talk about sustainability, and they still wouldn't know what I meant. They wouldn't
Right.
actually. I would say, "Well, what do you mean by sustainability?" And do you mean recycling, or do you mean? I mean, it was just a very um, I think actually there were two or three turning points. I think David Attenborough has had obviously a sort of broad impact on the UK market in terms of people
Mm.
understanding the climate crisis. There
Yeah.
are a lot of people who follow his program, so that helped. Greta Thunberg then obviously came in and was grabbing the headlines. So the fact that that then started to happen, whether people agreed with her or not,
Mm.
it started conversations. And then of course we had COP26, so the build up to that meant that a lot of mainstream TV programs and news programs were starting to report much more actively on things to do with the climate crisis. And meanwhile, there were things happening in the background. There were, disasters, floods, droughts, obviously lots of wildfires
Yeah.
devastating various parts of the world. And I think people started to think, actually, there is something here. There is something going on that's,
Mm.
that we have to start paying attention to. And so the narrative started to change, and everything to do with ESG and sustainability generally, I think, moved from the nice to have, tick a little box that we're doing a few good things,
Yeah.
into actually this is, mainstream existential stuff for
Yeah.
organizations who were starting to look very differently at what they were doing and how they were doing it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And I noticed you did a TEDx talk. Presumably that was around sustainability. Can you give a bit of background about what you discussed during the talk?
Yeah, so that was great actually. It was hugely exciting to be invited to do a TEDx, although I look
Mm.
back at it now and absolutely cringe. But
Mhm.
it was interesting in that around really from about 2008 onwards, when I'd been working with the architectural firm, one of the things that I noticed was that it was very difficult to get the market engaged in the good things they needed to do within buildings. So I started to look differently at it again. Sort of, this is having a marketing brain rather than a technical built environment brain, I suppose. But what was happening was that the architects were designing fabulous buildings that were very energy efficient and resource efficient. But as soon as they got to the stage where the sort of stage two sort of contract side of things, the contractors would get involved, and they would what's euphemistically called value engineer the project, which basically means strip out all the good stuff to bring the cost of the project down. And there was no correlation between the capex, the capital expenditure on putting a building together, and then the operating costs. And I felt that was something that was a huge weakness. And because
Right.
it tended to be sort of peers talking to each other, so you would get somebody from the client organisation or the project manager or whoever representing the client would be dealing with the architects, but actually very rarely were you having a conversation with the CEO or the FD of the organisation that might be occupying the building, or ultimately would have responsibility for its operating costs. So I started working on a series of presentations which were talking about the non-carbon and energy benefits of better buildings. So really focusing on the people side as much as anything else. So saying, actually, how can we quantify the paybacks that are going to come through you having better buildings, and that means not getting rid of the elements of the building that are going to make them perform better, be energy efficient, but also be much better in terms of human performance. So that involves things like air quality, access to natural light, ventilation rates, all of those sorts of things. But I actually sort of created a tool that would allow us to work with organisations to actually identify where their buildings weren't performing well at the moment, and then to quantify what the actual cost to them of those poor performing buildings were. And I did that for clients in the NHS and for commercial clients, and it ran into millions every time. It staggered the clients that they were so focused on the actual cost of the building, they weren't thinking about how it was going to impact on them later. So we were looking at things like staff retention rates and sickness absence rates and productivity, and then quantifying that. So it sounds a little bit abstract, but actually it is quite easy to work it out and to map any sort of building, whether it's a warehouse or a hospital or a school or an office building. You can map the correlation between the likelihood of people to sort of stay with that company or leave that company according to the red, amber and green areas of building performance. So that's really what my TED talk was about. It was about really trying to sort of explain to people the importance of actually looking at, the whole point of buildings is there for people to be in them. That is their sole purpose. They're not there for any other purpose other than, people to occupy them. Yet the design side of it tends to think of that last, not first. So I did lots of other presentations around that for various institutes and organisations and major exhibitions and conferences. The highlight being actually invited to speak at the World Green Building Congress in Singapore in 2010. So that was back in the days when I was allowing myself to fly, which I don't do now. But it was it was a really interesting thing that actually, it still hasn't really taken off as a concept, which is slightly frustrating, but there is an awful lot of work that we need to do in that space.
Okay. And when you're advising to clients, from a sustainability point of view, and you're putting together presumably some sort of sustainable plan, what's the first few things that you look at in terms of, I don't know, how they can reduce carbon or what they can do in a more sustainable way? Are there a few sort of trends or patterns when you're working with clients that always kind of stick out?
Yeah, it very much depends on the client and the brief they've given you. So one of the things that we're trying to do as a sustainability team at the moment is try and give ourselves the opportunity to take the widest possible remit we can. Some clients are very obsessed with net zero and carbon reduction, which is fine, and it's obviously critical and it needs to be done. But actually, you need to think about everything at the same time. You can't do that to the detriment of water use or biodiversity or anything else that's actually going to impact on the overall sustainability of the project. So it depends on the client. Sometimes we get a very narrow brief and we're only asked to look at a narrow list of requirements, and that would normally start with baselining, so looking at where they are now, what they're doing, how it's operating, and creating those sort of benchmarks, and then building up their plan from there. So if we've got a client who's allowing us to look at all of the impacts that they've got, and we can take a much more circular approach and a much more holistic view of their operations and their impacts, then that's fantastic, because that allows us then to start mapping everything and working through. Sometimes we need to work in a narrow zone, get the client's confidence, and then start introducing other factors as we go along.
Right. Okay. And are there any innovations out there that are helping to support ESG, net zero?
So in terms of innovations, I mean, it's an interesting one because I think a lot of clients looking for sort of silver bullets, and in a lot of respects, they're not really there in the format that they might want or expect. So I think the most important thing to start with is that energy or resource efficiency is always going to be the most effective thing you can do. So it's to start, for example, if we're looking at buildings, we call it fabric first. Look at the actual performance of the shell of the building and what it's doing. So all of that has to be sorted long before you start thinking about PV or I don't know, heat pumps or any sorts of other technologies. So we of course, get to the stage where we're recommending everything that can be done, but it's always starting with the fundamentals. Get the basics right. There is absolutely no point working to, and again, some clients want it. Some clients want to start with what we call the eco bling because it looks like they're doing more, and they think it sends a signal to the market and whatever, but it's not really the right way of doing it. So we would always advise clients to start with the basics. So it might be a bit dull and boring, and there might not be many things that are readily visible, but you can change that by, for example, by having energy monitors that staff can see, and you can start talking, communicating with your teams about energy reduction processes and things that you're doing. So it doesn't have to be in the background. The other thing that I think is really helpful at the moment is the pressure that's coming from the financial sides of the market. So a lot of organisations are finding that stakeholders, all sorts of stakeholders, are now demanding transparency and reporting, and there's mandatory financial reporting, TCFD, those sorts of things. So that's good. Those levers are coming from outside of people like us, and we obviously have to then respond to what the client needs to do in order to make sure that they're compliant. So there's lots of different levels it works on. Some are finding pressure from customers or from, as I say, the financial institutions, or it might be that their major competitors are starting to move up a few gears and they feel under pressure to follow. Some want to be leaders in their field, and again, they're looking to make announcements about getting to net zero by 2025 or 2030 or whatever it may be. And that's great. We're finding it's a sort of mix of all of those different things that are happening, really. And of course, the energy crisis, unfortunately, we hate it when negative things happen, but as soon as something negative happens, it does focus the mind. So, if there is a drought or flood or energy crisis, that does focus the market's minds on their vulnerability.
Certainly does, and sometimes it leads to that creativity or that innovation, or puts pressure on people to actually make a change.
Yeah.
So, are there any sort of big changes you see in the workplace, or from a consultancy business like Turner Townsend over the next few years that will sort of have an impact with net zero?
I think there's quite a number of changes happening in the market. Some of them are again coming from government incentives. So we do a lot of work with housing, for example, and in the social housing sector, there's some funds called the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and there are other sort of regional based funds that are coming forward as well that are really helping to sort of pump prime the market by sort of softening the blow, if you like, of the cost of some of the interventions. And that, alongside with other work that's being done to stimulate supply side and skills, means that we're opening up the market to other tenures of housing, like private rented and owner occupied, and also it will influence the commercial sector as well, again with supply chains that will be ready to mobilise and provide the services that are required. So that's really helpful. And I think the other things I mentioned before, like market pressure, that is showing that actually there is a payback to a lot of these interventions, because they will provide a really important opportunity for whether it's performance, on the balance sheet, or whether it's retaining important clients. Public procurement will mandate a lot of these things to be part of the process anyway. I suppose that's pretty much all I've got to say, apart from the fact that I suppose we're in a really exciting phase at the moment, and what myself and others feel very strongly is that we've got this fantastic opportunity to make sure that everyone gets on board. So all of the things that we're doing and talking about aren't just to do with people who've got sustainability in their job title. It's actually everyone's job to be an advocate for the environment, for taking responsibility in their role or within their organisation for what they're doing and their impacts, and for making sure they've actually got something in Wales called the Future Generations Act, which kind of sums it up. And we kind of all need to do that. We all need to be protecting all of our lives and livelihoods really for future generations, and obviously making sure that our environment is protected. So I think that's probably the best point at which to end the podcast. So thanks very much again for inviting me.
Thanks very much for your time, Sarah. I really appreciate it. That was very, very interesting. And yeah, thanks again. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.